Let's start by having a look at the splash screen and top bar as we make our way through the user interface. The splash screen always appears when you open a project in Blender. Having a look at the left side here, we see options for creating a new file. We can click on any of these to start with a specific workspace. By default, we are in the general workspace. Below this, you can open a file or open back to the last session that you were working in. If you now look to the right, you can see the Getting Started region. Here we see options for learning about Blender, much like we are doing here in this course. In Face, you will find sometimes that I am reading the documentation verbatim. You can find documentation for the topics we are covering in the manual link. To exit the splash screen, you can simply click somewhere outside of it, or press the Escape key on your keyboard. Now let's get familiar with the Blender user interface, or UI for short. If we click this little Blender icon up here on the top left, we can reopen the splash screen if we want to go back to it. Up here on the top right of the splash screen, we can see what version we are using. In our case, this is Blender version 4.0.1. Also in here, we can see some about stuff. We also see a few things that we will cover at a later time, such as the application template, which lets you to define a reusable configuration that can be selected to replace the default configuration that you would normally get on startup. Next, we see the File menu to the right of the Blender icon. The options to manage files are as follows. Creating a new file. The hotkey command to do that is Control or Command +N on your keyboard. Creating a new file clears the current scene and loads the selected application template. Opening a file from memory, Control or Command +O. Selecting this option will open a window and prompt you to open a file that you already have saved on your hard disk. Open a recent file, Shift + Control or Command +O. This is similar to just opening a file. However, this displays a list of the most recently opened blend files. Select any of the file names in the list to open that blend file. Revert reopens the current file to its last saved version. Recover recovers the last session. This will load a blend file that Blender automatically saves just before exiting. So this option enables you to recover your last work session, e.g. if you closed Blender by accident. We all know that will never happen to you, but it's nice to have this option, just in case. Recover autosave. This will open an automatically saved file to recover it. This is similar to the last option. Save the current blend file. What this does should be self-explanatory. The hotkey for this is Control or Command +S. Save incremental. Save the current Blender file with a numerically incremented name that does not overwrite any existing files. Save as. Opens the file browser to specify file name and location of save. The hotkey for Save As is Shift + Control or Command +S. Save Copy saves a copy of the current file. Moving downward, we move on to less obvious file features. The Link option. The Link option links data from an external blend file, library, to the current one. The editing of that data is only possible in the external library. This feature is great for team-based work and is a way that one can link assets from one project to one another. For example, a creator can have an asset in someone else's project and still make changes to it from their own project without the other person being able to edit their asset. The Append option. The Append option appends data from an external blend file to the current one. The new data is copied from the external file and completely unlinked from it. Think importing. The Data Previews option displays tools for managing data block previews. The Import option. Unlike Append, the Import option allows Blender to use information stored in a variety of other format files, which are created by other graphics programs. The Export option. Normally, you save your work in a blend file, but you can export some or all of your work to a format that can be processed by other graphics programs. The External Data option. External data, like texture images and other resources, can be stored inside the blend file, packed, or as separate files, unpacked. Blender keeps track of all unpacked resources via a relative or absolute path. CPack or unpack external data. Cleanup cleans up unused data blocks. This will remove unused data blocks from both the current blend file and any linked data. This cannot be undone. This can also be done recursively. Defaults. This menu manages the startup file, which is used to store the default scene, workspace, and interface displayed when creating a new file. Initially, this contains the startup scene included with Blender. This can be replaced by your own customized setup. Save startup file saves the current blend file as the startup file. This will become what you see when you launch the Blender software. Load factory settings restores the default startup file and preferences. And lastly, there is the quit menu. If you want to end this lesson now, just click this option and close the video. See you next time. Oh? You decided to stay? Right. Then let's continue to the right with the Edit menu. The Edit menu. First, we see the Undo, Redo, Undo history. We won't spend much time here as we assume you are familiar with how these work. The hotkeys to undo and redo are Control or Command, plus Z, and Shift plus Control or Command, plus Z respectively. Adjust last operation, repeat last, repeat history. The three options here are also self-explanatory. They can save you time, however, by repeating actions that you have already taken. Menu search. Find a menu based on its name. This option pops up a menu that allows you to search for other menus inside of Blender, which is helpful if you need to find something without knowing where it is located. You can open this menu with the hotkey of F3 on your keyboard. Rename active item. Rename the active object or node. The hotkey for this is F2. Batch rename renames multiple data types at once. Lock object modes prevents selecting objects that are in a different mode than the current one. This option can prevent accidental mode changes, such as when you're trying to select a bone in pose mode to animate it, but instead click a piece of background scenery, which would normally select that piece and switch to object mode. And lastly, in the Edit menu, you can edit your preferences for Blender. We will not be touching much on this, but have a look at it yourself and see what you like. I would recommend leaving these alone for now if you plan to be following this tutorial, as it could otherwise make things confusing if you change too much. However, in your preferences, if you are using a laptop or a keyboard without a number pad, I would recommend that you select Input and tick the box that says Emulate Numpad. We will be using the numpad later in the course. This will make it so that your num keys on the top of your keyboard can act as a numpad. To the right, we see the Render menu. We will explore rendering scenes later, but in the meanwhile, you can render image this menu or with F12, which render the active scene at the current frame. Render animation with Control or Command plus F12, which renders the animation of the active scene. Or render audio, which mixes the scene's audio to a sound file. After rendering your scene, you can view render with F11, or view animation Control or Command plus F11. If you are pressed for memory, you can press Lock Interface, which will lock the interface during rendering in favor of giving more memory to the renderer. Again, we will cover all of this in the future, so let's move on to the Window menu. In the Window menu, you select New Window, which creates a new window by copying the current window, or New Main Window, which will create a new window with its own workspace and scene selection. You can toggle Window Full Screen, which will toggle the current window full screen. Next Workspace, which will switch to the next workspace. Previous Workspace, which will switch to the previous workspace. Show Status Bar, which will choose whether the status bar at the bottom of the window should be displayed. Save Screenshot, which will capture a picture of the current Blender window. A file browser will open to choose where the screenshot is saved. Or Save Screenshot, or capture a picture of the selected editor. Select the editor by clicking the left mouse button within its area after running the operator. A file browser will open to choose where the screenshot is saved. And lastly, we have the Help menu. The Help menu will give you any resources that you need. I am not going to cover that here, as it is something that is best played around with for yourself. You will find resources and tutorials here, as well as the manual and documentation for Blender in general. The documentation is how I learn as well.